Hey guys, Jason from AFS. Just want to start off by thanking you for buying a tube front for your 2009 through 15 V2. Got to start off right away with the whole legal disclaimer thing, which is once you decide to cut off the front end of your car and weld these front ends on, obviously your car is for drag racing purposes only. We can't guarantee that the front end that you put on the car is going to absorb impact the same way that your factory front end will. So these are for race cars only. Whether you decide to drive your car on the street after this or not, obviously is completely on you. So that part out of the way, the whole idea behind this video today is just to help you put the front end of your car together. We're going to go over some tips and tricks and unbox a kit in front of you on the contents of the kit, what we provide. There's two different versions of the kit depending on what you ordered. You're going to get two different you're going to get one of two upper radiator supports. One would be retaining the factory hood latch. The other one is not retaining the factory hood latch, but allows you to use like a center style intercooler that brings the charge pipe directly up and over the radiator where the hood latch would be and go straight into your throttle body. So depending on if you're turbo or blower, or if you really wanted to retain your hood latch, that's going to decide which kit you have. One thing that we want to say right away too is this can be a little intimidating to do. You're cutting the front end of your car off, but the kit is relatively simple. It's pretty easy to put on. You can do this in a weekend. You can tear the front end of your car apart in under 2 hours. You can have the radiator out of the thing, the front end cut off, and be getting ready to put the front end on. So as long as you have a buddy there to help you, chances are you're going to get through this with no issues. You can completely do it by yourself. I do this stuff by myself all the time. Obviously, I'm used to it. But we're going to try and help you get through this, even if you have to do it by yourself, even if you're lacking things that a fab shop such as myself has, which would be things like, a welding table to set jigs up on. I'm going to go through how you can make a basic jig on creating the parts nice and straight, because that's going to be the number one thing is your lower rail support and front crash bar, and then the lower bumper cover support. Those pieces you want nice and square so that when you attach them to the car, everything is square and you can pull consistent measurements left and right on the front end of the car to make sure the headlights line up, your hood latch lines up, your fenders all line up. Those parts are all pretty adjustable on these cars. You can slide your fenders around, you can slide your hood around. So it's not going to be too bad for you to put it together. And keep in mind too, if you need an extra tab, or if something goes wrong and you mess up a tube, you burn through it bad while you're trying to weld it and it just doesn't fit good or it doesn't look good, as long as you're not in a huge hurry, get me a drawing or tell me what piece you need. I'll go ahead and package up another piece or make it, whatever I need to do, and I'll ship it out to you at the, basically just cost. Whatever it costs for me for the material and the shipping, I'll send it out to you. I'm not looking to get rich off these kits. In fact, I wasn't even planning on doing the kits, but when I posted up on the group, you guys were super excited about it. The room that it provides, the weight loss that it has. So unfortunately, the front end of my car is already cut off, so I can't really go through the actual physically cutting the front end off in front of you. However, I'm going to show you exactly where to cut, how to put the tabs on, where to draw measurements from. Because the whole part of me actually cutting off, it's really not going to gain anything for you. The nice thing is it's pretty self-explanatory where to cut once I show you. There's some factory brackets that are in place you're literally just going to run right along where the bracket is. Could I have cut more of the front end off? Absolutely, to save a little bit more weight. But you're talking 1 or 2 pounds if we cut a little more lower rail, a little more upper rail. And it just wasn't worth going that far back into the car, because it gets tougher to do the measurements equally. You have to find other points on the car to measure from, versus where we decided to cut the front end. It's literally where a bracket stops. So it's literally take a Sharpie and a straight edge and mark it, use a square, make sure that your cut isn't going on an angle on you, and then just take your time. Don't get the Sawzall in your hands and just buzz right through the front end. Take your time cutting each side of it. You could either do that through a cutoff wheel, 4.5-inch grinder with a cutting disc on it. Could you use a Sawzall? Absolutely, but what you'll want to do is you'll want to cut on the air of caution more into the front of the car versus the chassis of the car, because you can always grind that back, right? If you remove too much material, you're done. But if you don't remove enough, it's pretty easy to take the flap disc on a 4.5 inch grinder and slowly touch it and keep checking it with a square and just keep working that material back until you can put the end cap on, MIG weld that sucker in place, and then we can go ahead and get started on putting the tubes on. Other than that, with that all said, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start opening up a box for you the exact same way it's going to be shipped to you. You know, you see me open it up, we'll go through the parts that are in there. There's extra tabs in there. There's extra material for you to hand cut. And I even include a little bit of 4130 moly tube inside there, like 6 inches worth. If for any reason, like I said, you get into a situation where you need something extra, I'll take care of you. You might say, hey, you know, can you bend me a piece of tube with a 45 on it and cope it on one end, and it needs to be, you know, X amount of inches long. Just shoot me a message, give me a call. I'll make that piece for you quickly. I've got thousands of feet of material in stock in all different types of sizes. The rest of the material that you might need, you know, go ahead and just run off to Tractor Supply, if you've got one in your area, or anything comparable. Even hardware stores, Lowe's and Home Depot surprisingly actually have a good selection of small tubing, flat bar, things of that nature that you can just run to a local store and grab a piece of bar stock that you might need to mount something, and you'll get through what you need to get through. The kit has plenty of room in there. You're going to be loving life when it comes to seeing the amount of room that you have, that you can position your radiator differently if you want to, putting an intercooler in, using turbo mounts where you can come off of the frame with a small piece of tube and go right to a turbo mount and hang the turbos in front of the car. Pretty much your imagination is your limit on the front end with the amount of room that we increase, even with the radiator in the stock location, let alone the parts that I give you to move your radiator to a different location if you decide to help increase airflow on the front of the car and packaging constraints when it comes to, like I said, twin turbo, single turbo, or even blower guys. You know, an issue I ran into on my car and what started this whole tube front was I've got a 2650 race ported 120 millimeter throttle body, and I was trying to build a cold air intake to come off of that throttle body and make that turn over to the driver's side, and the radiator's in the way. You know, I just didn't like the radius that I was getting off of that throttle body for maximum airflow. And on the dyno, the last time I tested intakes, just shortening that intake and having less flow, I picked up 20 wheel on a pole back to back, and that was literally with 0 tune changes. We just slapped the thing on and tested it, and bam, you know. So with a blower car, you'd be surprised how important that airflow is pre-throttle body, and keeping that intake as short as possible. It will flow way more air than any of those snorkel intakes that go way down below the headlight. You think you're doing good because you're getting it down into the fog light area where there's fresh air coming, but the reality is more airflow is better than worrying about it being perfectly cold, just not having that restriction on the front of the blower. So anyways, let's go ahead and get a kit opened up. We'll go through that aspect of it, and then we'll go ahead and start putting the kit on the front of the car. All right, guys, so here is the kit. This is how it's going to come to you. 3-foot box, 6x6. You wouldn't think the entire front end fits in here, but it does. So we're going to go ahead and open it up, show you the stuff that comes in here, and go through it all with you. So in here, in this, you've got a piece of 6x6 11 gauge plate. This would just be an extra piece of plate that you can hand cut any type of mounting tabs that you want out of it, put it in a vise, smack it over on 90 degrees, do whatever you want to do. Mild steel, easy to work with. Then we have all of our hardware here. So everything is in individual bags. I'll cut that open in a second. I'll show you that everything's labeled out nicely for you. There's extra parts in there along with everything that you need for the kit. Then inside the kit, all wrapped up nice in tube. our plastic tube. This is the actual kit itself. All these parts here, they are labeled, and again, tubing is pre-sanded, ready to go. So the nice thing here is you can basically get this thing tacked onto your front end of your car, get it all welded up when you're done, and go ahead and hit it with some zinc chromate primer right out of a rattle can, or if you've got access to good painting tools, go ahead and paint it like a standard automotive paint would be done. But right to primer and then right to paint. Little tidbit of info, just so you guys know, you can pretty much go to any automotive supplier that mixes paint, and they can mix in a spray can for you the actual paint coat of your car. So if you really want your front end to look nice, spend the 40 or 50 bucks on a spray can with your actual paint coat in it, and it will look like $1 million when you're done. You get that all sanded, or not sanded, but all prepped with the primer. Scuff it, then go ahead and hit it with your rattle can paint. They can make it as a base coat setup, and then you can clear coat over it with another rattle can, or they can do it in a single stage setup where it's just regular acrylic paint that has gloss to it when it dries. So in here in this kit, got a few things going on here. Okay, slice through. So right here, these two are your, they're labeled driver and passenger. There's a label on the other side there. These guys are already coked inside. Open this up. These two bars here are the bars that come down off of the corner of the car. They run along the side of the headlight, drop down on the frame rail. And as you can see, I've already taken the time to clean these things up. The only suggestion that I would give for you is I did not clean the inside of these tubes. So prior to mounting them on the car, you're going to want to hit these with a little bit of brake clean or some acetone on the inside, because 4130 is basically pulled through a die and it's lubricated as it goes. So there's going to be some oil in there. And the main thing to having your welds turn out nice is everything being clean. So the nice thing is I've sanded all the mill scale off the tubing for you. It's not there, so the tubing is beautifully clean. You'd still want to wipe down the tube with some acetone on a rag, and like I said, clean the inside of the tube, because when you're welding, that heat will pull any oil that's inside that tube. It will pull it into the weld and mess with you on the weld. Another thing while we're talking about welding, the rod that you use. You've got dissimilar metals, you've got mild steel in the kit, you've got 4130, because unfortunately Dolco R8 is not available in 1-inch. They're telling me with time their machine will be back up to do 1-inch, but all of us racers, we're all waiting for the 1-inch to come back because Dolco is superior to 4130. But unfortunately we got to work with 4130 for now in 1-inch. So anyways, dissimilar metals, both high strength, but then welding to mild steel, you would use a 702 or a 706 rod. I prefer 706, reason being it has some other properties in the rod that really help any contaminants come out of the weld and work towards the surface. I think 706 rod is some of the nicest welding rod I've ever worked with when it comes to welding metals together. The Dolco welds beautiful. 4130 certainly welds nicer with the 706. You don't have to worry about PSI strengths here. The 706 rod is plenty strong for what you're doing, and you have to use it anyways when you're going to the mild steel plates, when you're connecting the tube to the plate on the car. So 706 rod preferably. If your local supplier, all you have is 702, it will do the same thing, just that 706 has those extra properties to really make the weld layout a little nicer in case there's some extra contaminants there in the metal. So these two bars, again, run off the headlight down to the main lower rails. And in this kit here, let's open this up. This guy here is your main crash bar. Call it a crash bar, but hopefully that doesn't happen. So this guy sits up underneath the nose of your bumper, will hold it from sagging. part of the install in this kit that you're going to be messing with is just adjusting a little bit of the height of this, and this is what's going to keep your whole nose from sagging down on the car. Upper radiator support, again labeled. This is what your hood latch is going to attach to. Lower bumper. This guy here is going to go down low, and you get 4 mounting tabs in the kit that you weld onto this throughout, and it actually grabs the 4 factory locations on the lower bumper cover right in front of the radiator where you put your push pins in. This will keep your bumper cover from flopping around, and also helps with sag too, because depending on where you place this, you can push the lower part of the cover out or pull it in to adjust how it lines up on your fenders, and how it lines up on your headlights as well. So okay. So here we have pipe and pipe. So 1.25" pipe is your main. This is Dolco R8. This is your 2 lower rails to the car. So again, these are nicely ground, cleaned up. The tube is coped. Other end is just straight. This is what mounts on the frame of the car. This guy fits like this and goes beautifully, as you can see. The copes are done nice, so as long as you're a halfway decent welder, you're going to make this thing look like $1 million when you put it together. The smaller 1-inch piece, this guy right here, is for your lower bumper support. So this is going to be an upright that goes up to your frame rail. This guy sits here like this, about like that. Okay. Now, one thing to pay attention to is the copes are different. One side is coped for 1-inch tube, the other side is coped for 1.25", and they are 90 degrees different. So when you go to put this together, if for any reason you go to put this on and the cope doesn't look quite right, that's because you've got it wrong. You need to flip it until it's nice and tight. That thing will lay right on there beautifully tight. Again, if you got a little bit of a gap, you got your tube wrong, and you'll know because when you go to run this piece, it does this. There's a gap, and there should be no gap. Okay? So let's set this aside, and we'll open up this pouch here and show you all the cool stuff in there. All these tabs are all laser cut. Keep in mind that anything that's laser cut is incredibly sharp, believe it or not. So you might want to take some time to possibly deburr it. Again, the tabs in here, nothing is sanded ready for paint in here with the exception of pieces of tube. So get yourself a little cookie disc grinder to clean those parts up. Okay, so in here we have everything labeled real nice. So for example, right here is your hood latch. There are mounting tabs for the hood latch itself, little pieces of pipe that are already coped and ground and cleaned up, and there's hardware here. These are standard 1/4" 20 bolts. One thing that you will end up needing to do this kit is you're going to need a nutsert tool. If you're not familiar with what nutserts are, I've got a finished radiator support over here, and that's these guys right here. So this is what your upper core support, radiator support will look like as far as holding the hood latch goes. Nutsert's a really cool tool. Once you take these pieces and attach them onto the bar, it's going to look something like this. Drill the holes, put the nutserts in. These things are basically like a rivet that clamps in. From that point, you're able to go ahead and just bolt your factory hood latch right to this piece of tube. So if you need a nutsert tool, they're incredibly affordable on Amazon. Heck, even our Harbor Freight has them. I think it was, last time I bought a cheap one, I want to say it was like 25 bucks. If you don't have one, get one, because there's a lot of uses for them once you actually have them. So set this aside. Going back in, right here we've got labeled headlight tabs. So these guys right here are going to be for the lower section of your headlight on the inside. We're going to use those tabs to mount directly to the steel tubing, and it comes with hardware as well. 1/4 inch 20 bolts in there with some nylon lock nuts and a couple of washers. Okay. Couple of extra tabs. We got some 4-inch long tabs there and some 2-inch long tabs, 3/8 holes already in them. These are just extra tabs that you could use for mounting an intercooler or hanging any other radiators or whatever on there. If you need anything else like this, again, just feel free, shoot me a message. If you give me a basic drawing, these tabs cost me, I think, about $3 a piece to have lasered in 11 gauge. So that cost plus whatever it costs to ship it to you, I'll take care of you. I can make you any length you want. You might want something that's a little bit longer because you're going to put it in the vise and bend it down to 90. Maybe a slightly different shape. Maybe you want it lasered with a smaller or larger hole, depending on what you're trying to do. Again, just reach out to me. I can have that part made up and send it off to you. Core support. So this guy right here, 2 tabs. These are going to be for the upper core support that gets your hood latch. The upper core support comes with these 2 guys here. These are billet 4130 threaded inserts. This slides perfectly inside your upper tube, inside the 1-inch tube. You're going to slide this in and you're going to end up welding it to the end, and then you have grade 8 hardware. These bolts bolt through these 2 tabs, which mount on the down bars by the headlights. Reason we did this, I had a few guys reach out to me and say, hey, can part of this unbolt? Now your whole upper radiator support can come out, so if you need to work on the front of the car, it's real easy to just unbolt the upper rad support, remove it, and you can come right out the front of the car with the motor real easily without having to get those crazy driveline angles to get it up and over the radiator support and not smash it. All right, let's see here. Okay, bumper tabs to the lower. So this is your lower support. These are the 4 tabs I was talking about that on the lower support allow you to hold the bumper cover with your factory push pins and keep that bumper cover in place. Right here we have hood bump stops. Now, these guys, what's neat is they're laser etched right here. This tells you where to put it in a vise, or if you have a sheet metal brake, you can break it. You're going to bend these things at 90 degrees. The parts are flipped opposite, and when we get into building the car, I'll show you where these go. It's pretty cool. It bolts directly underneath a fender bolt to hold it in place, and then lands on a piece of the chassis of the car. And you can take your factory rubber hood stops and screw them down into these guys, and that will adjust your hood on each side. I'll show you what they kind of look like here. Here's one. So this was on my car already, right where the laser was etched. I literally just threw it in the vise, smacked it with a hammer and bent it. And then what you do is you take a screwdriver, stick it in here, give it a little bit of a tweak, and that allows it so that the rubber can screw down into that just like factory it does on the factory core support. So that's what that'll end up looking like. We have lower rail caps. So this is for the main frame on the car. Down here, if you can put the camera in, so this is where they end up. These guys go right here. MIG weld goes on. No reason to TIG weld it. You're going to find, although the TIG welding would look nice if you do it on here, these cars have galvanized into the metal. It's easier to just go ahead and MIG weld it. You're not really going to see those things anyways, and you can go, if you want it to look pretty, you can go back through and clean it up with a cookie and grind it a little bit. But your best option is to just stick these things on, tack them with the MIG welder once they're in place, and then go ahead and just weld them right up solid with the MIG. It's fast, it will look fine. By the time you get done doing everything else in the car, no one's going to be worried about what a MIG weld looks like versus a TIG weld. And on that subject, if you're not familiar, 4130, you have to TIG weld it. Can you MIG weld it? Absolutely. But you really should be TIG welding this front end together. Dole coal is perfectly fine to MIG weld. It's really unique in the aspect of you can MIG weld any part of dole coal and it's perfectly happy. 4130, you really need to TIG weld it. Can you go ahead and MIG weld this if you don't have access to a TIG welder? Absolutely. It's not like this thing is a life-saving device like a roll cage is, so it's probably not that big of a deal. But if you want the best strength and the best look possible, you really should TIG weld this kit together. Leave the MIG welding to just your end rail caps that you MIG onto the car. Those welds are perfectly strong, and you'll end up with a nice weld on there. But the rest of the kit, do it by TIG, if you can. Let's see. Here's our upper rail caps. So these guys here, let's open this up. They're hiding right there. So this is what I was talking about, just MIG weld them in. These caps are lasered to shape. They're the same right and left. You just flip the plate to either side of the car. Lower support caps. These are just a 1-inch lasered cap. This goes on the bumper cover if you want to cap them off. If you want to run them, you can. If you don't want to, that's fine. Just a beauty part, essentially, that I included so that you've got it. These guys here are radiator supports for the lower. When we get the kit together, we'll go over why I've included these. I'm not overly fond of the factory location of the radiator. A lot of guys talk about the heat issues that we have in these cars and the heat soak. And believe it or not, a lot of that comes from the fact that the radiator is stuffed literally 3 inches away from the motor, okay? So you've got 200-degree air coming out of the back of that radiator, and it is just slamming the front of the motor. It's got nowhere to go. And even the factory fans can flow a lot more air than they do if you move that radiator a little bit. So think about it this way. If you took a box fan and you set it against a wall, like 3 inches away, how well is that thing going to flow air? You could put an airflow meter in front of it, and if you put it 3 inches away from a wall, it's going to flow who knows how many percentage less air. So with this tube front end, there's plenty of room to move that radiator forward a few more inches and lower it down. And what it does is it actually puts more of the radiator into the openings of the grill, because if you look at how your car is set up, that radiator sits a couple inches above the opening of the upper grill. So a lot of that radiator up in the front is blocked from the factory core support, and it's sitting up high. You can move this radiator down and forward a couple inches, and you can gain a lot of room between the radiator and the motor to allow that air to come out and turn and go where it needs to go. There's so much extra front end into this car once we put the kit in that you can move that radiator forward and drop it down, and it's just not going to affect the amount of room you have in the front.
All right, we had some technical difficulties with the audio, so unfortunately we're going to switch over to some voiceover on the video now. So here we're opening up the tow hook bag. There's 3 pieces in there. You've got the threaded insert that's going to come with the kit, piece that connects the threaded insert to the lower main rail, and also a piece of plate there that actually supports the tow hook from the backside, so that when you put a load on the car, it doesn't flex everything. It just connects everything to the lower rail. That's what I'm going over there, is that piece is connecting the lower rail to the drop down and threaded insert, so it doesn't pull away. Here I'm going over the process of getting the fender opened up on the car. There's a right way and a wrong way to do this. The wrong way is the way that I did it, which is I unbolted my fender as much as I could and just kind of flexed the fender out of the way to get to where to cut the car. The right way would be pulling your rocker panel off and fully unbolting your fender to get it out of the way. If you flex it over like this to cut it, that's fine. Just keep in mind you might tweak things a little bit. This right here is the area where you actually cut the upper frame rail of the car. Right where that bracket ends is where you're going to cut the upper frame rail. It's spot welded on there. Just take a Sharpie and continue a line, and you can cut that back and use a flap disc grinder to clean it up. That bolt hole right there for the fender is also going to be exactly where you bolt the bump stop for the hood onto, using the factory location. Now that's going to raise the fender up a hair, but that's okay because you can adjust the hood up to match the fender. You're not going to notice any real differences there in the front end of the car, the way it lines up. This is just one of the main cutoff wheel tools that I prefer to use when you're cutting the rails. It's going to cut a lot slower than a 4.5-inch grinder, but you can get these things from Harbor Freight if you don't want to spend any big money on an Ingersoll Rand. It's a lot easier tool to control than a standard cutoff wheel. You've got that long shaft to it where you can really get your hand wrapped around it. Take your time, go back and forth, and slice this rail off. Always err on the side of caution to cutting towards the front of the car rather than back into the rail, because you can go back and you can clean this up with a flap disc grinder, and if you overcut it towards the car, the issue becomes that you can't add material back on without doing a bunch of work. So if you're a little nervous, just keep your cut closer to the front of the car rather than the rear of the car. Now this is the front section of the car. I'm going over here where you cut down. So you literally just follow that bracket going down, and that's the point that you cut at, and you cut nice and straight down. Again, take your time cutting this piece. If you need to, err towards cutting towards the crash bar section of the car, and you can go back to the lower rail on the car itself and grind it back. I'm showing here, I was having a hard time cutting it, getting in there. So what I did is I just cut more towards the front of the car, got the piece out of the way off the car, and you can go back to the frame rail of the car and shorten it by just slightly grinding it, which is what I'm talking about here. You can go back and just work that back a little bit more with a flap disc grinder rather than cutting too much of the car out. Now, you want to make sure that that lower frame rail, you have ground it and cut it nice and straight both ways on a 90. So use a little speed square to make sure that everything is straight, because if you don't get this part of the process right, it's going to make you have a hard time lining the front end of the car up. So just take your time, cut it off nice and slow, clean it up with a flap disc grinder, nice and straight, slap that cap on there, and throw a couple tack welds on it. Make sure you like it, check it. If you don't, take it back off and grind it up a little bit more. You can also draw a measurement from those two oval holes on each side to make sure that both rails are the same length. That's what I'm referring to there. Again, if one rail is longer than the other, the issue becomes you throw the front end out of square. So when you're trying to pull a cross measurement to line up that front end, things are not going to pull the same measurement, and it's going to throw you off. So make sure those rails are cut nice and square and at the same length of each other, and you can reference those ovaled holes to get you where you need to be. Okay, as you're seeing here on the lower caps, what I've done is I've marked out where that tube is going to land, approximately 1 inch in from the inside and 2 inches down from the top. That line is basically going to line up with the pinch weld area of the car up there. The round tube, the lower rails, are going to line up in that area on both sides. This ends up giving you a consistent measurement of what the lower rails are going to be. You're going to be building a jig that is set at 31 inches inside to inside on those lower rails, and you position the lower rail on those two lines right where I'm drawing the circle. That's your imaginary spot where the tube is going to be sticking off of it. And then the two lower rails go straight forward, perfectly square. I'll show you in a little bit here the jig that we build out of a piece of wood. And there I'm holding that up. That's how that tube lands. Again, 2 inches from the top, 1 inch from the inside, and you're going to land the tube on the two lines. Now here, what I'm talking about is you typically take either a tab or a piece of scrap metal and put it underneath that tube and tack it. And we use a piece of 1/16 welding rod to space between the tube and the end plate, because what that allows you to do is tip that tube up or down, because tipping of that tube up or down is going to be what sets the height of the front end of the car. All right, here we have a basic jig that I built for the lower frame rails and front crash bar, and also your lower support. This is just a piece of 12-inch by 48-inch shelving from a local supply store. This is being done because not everyone's going to have a weld table. So I just wanted to build a jig out of wood to show you guys how to build something that, you can clamp the tubing nice and square on to make sure that those front frame rails are nice and straight. The ID of the frame rails of the two lower rails to the crash bar is 31 inches ID, and you're going to carry that measurement both at the car when you have it tacked onto the lower rail caps and also the leading edge of the crash bar. So here what I have is I took a couple pieces of the wood and set them up, screwed them down onto the wood so that they were perfectly square, and at the 31-inch ID for when I set the tubes in. And then when it's time to do um, the lower support, which would be your lower radiator support, that's 31 1/4 inches. What I do is I move the block of wood out exactly a 1/4 inch. That gives me my 31 1/4 ID, and I'm able to use the same jig for both the lower rail pieces with the crash bar attached and also for the lower radiator support, all on the same piece of wood. Again, this just holds everything flat, gives you something to clamp to. That way you can put several tacks on these pieces of tube and not have them walk all over the place. Keep everything nice and square. Again, this is the most important part of the build, really, is making sure that those two assemblies are square, because you're going to be drawing measurements off of the car to those, making sure that your headlights are square, your fenders are square. And that's what I'm talking about there, is that this jig will help you keep those tubes running parallel with each other, rather than ending up with a 1/4 inch of a 1/4 inch off on a cross angle measurement. So here I'm just going ahead and just putting the pieces in. So go ahead and just watch how I set that up. We put some clamps on it, tack it together. Okay, here I'm getting ready to put a mark on the tube of where the lower radiator support is going to come. So drawing from the end that attaches at the car, um, the ID mark I'm going to set, I believe, is about a 6 3/4. Now that number can change. It can be longer. It can be shorter. It's going to depend on your setup and how you align the front end. But this is a good starting point for you to just go ahead and throw a couple tacks on the tube. And remember, at any point you can break those tacks and slide this assembly forward or backwards. That will depend on, again, how you align your front end, how much you've ground off your lower rails, and also how you decide to set up your radiator. If you're going to set your radiator up like factory, it's going to be pretty close to that mark. If you decide to put your radiator further forward, further back, lay it on an angle, depending on the kit that you bought from me, those measurements can change. But again, 6 3/4 ID from that edge of the tube where I'm holding the magnet back to the cap on the lower frame rail is a good start. And that should basically run 90 degrees perpendicular off of those lower rails. So that's what I've done there, is just put the marks on the tubes, and we're going to go ahead and tack it in place while it's sitting on the jig. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I am setting up a couple of the tabs from the kit, just tacking them in place on that lower line that's set at 2 inches. The reason for this is just going to help you set the front end on the car and keep it in place until you get everything tack welded. Small tacks on each side of the tube. This will just help you get it broken free after the fact. If you don't want to use tabs from the kit, you can go ahead and just grab a piece of scrap metal. Maybe you got something kicking around. I'm setting them at roughly 90 degrees off of those end plates. Again, you can either hammer them up or hammer them down as far as the angle goes when the rails are tipped off of the front of that car. Again, for the most part, those are going to run pretty much parallel with the rail of the car. It should be pretty much level with it in a sense. The rails don't run level to the ground in the car. They run actually on an upward angle. However, that lower assembly is going to run, for the most part, very close to the same angle of the factory frame rails. And again, you're going to adjust that based on how much bumper sag you have or where you want to place it. So a couple small tacks on each side of the plate, just putting those in place, and then we can set the assembly up on there. and start tacking it in place and adjusting accordingly. Okay, here I'm getting ready to put the assembly on the car. You can use a floor jack, you could use jack stands, blocks of wood. Jack stands and blocks of wood, probably even better to an extent because it's a little bit less wobbly. But we set this in place on the car. See, I'm struggling with the jack a little bit again, but I'm trying to do this in a way that you guys at home might be doing this, and also doing it by myself versus having a second set of hands. That was the idea behind this video, is watch me put this together by myself with no help, so that if you got a buddy that comes over with a 6-pack of beer, you're going to be just fine. You guys can work on it together. One guy can be holding it, the other guy can be tacking. But we set this on the edge of the car, using some magnets trying to hold it in place. Doesn't always work, but that's where that second set of hands will come in and help to keep it there. Once I get it set in place, you're going to see right now I believe I'm looking for a little piece of 1/16 welding rod. We're going to go ahead and put a piece of welding rod between the tube and the lower rail cap, which is what I'm getting ready to do there. The reason that we do that is so that this front end can actually be jacked up or down to adjust the bumper sag. If we push those tubes directly into the lower caps, then when you tack it, you can't flex it up or down because it's fighting itself. So with a small gap, you're able to adjust it. Now here I'm going and putting the what I guess you would call the headlight tubes in place. This is the tube that's going to have your lower bracket to the headlight. These tubes will end up with a very similar measurement, somewhere between 2 inches and 2¼ inches, is which I'm setting it at right there, between the center of the hole of the headlight and the outside edge of the tube, and you position that accordingly. Now this tube right here, where you land it up on the upper frame horn, where I'm looking at it right now, is going to depend on where your bumper cover lands on top of it. So what I mean by that is there is a hole in your upper bumper cover that you're going to end up putting a nutsert in that tube and bolting it in. You're going to swing that tube, or I should say rotate it, in or out on that upper frame rail so that when you push down on your bumper cover, it lands directly over the center of that tube. So just keep in mind, you might have to break, where you set that thing on there, you might have to break the tack and swing it a little bit and re-tack it again if the bumper cover is not lining up with that tube. But the measurements should stay in between that 2 inch and 2¼ inch mark point at the bottom, because that's what's setting the angle of the tube, but you can rotate the tube in or out on that upper frame horn plate. In the video here, you're going to see I have that tube pretty close to the edge. We didn't go over it later in this video, but I ended up having to cut the tacks and actually rotate that out towards the outside of the car to where I had probably a good 5/16 of an inch between the edge of the tube and the plate. So swinging it, rotating it out towards the outside edge of the car. I landed too close to the edge. I actually needed to move them because even my bumper cover did not line up properly on the tube. I just started with it rotated in too far. But again, keep in mind, this stuff you're putting it in place with a couple of tacks. Do not fully weld anything. You should be going through this entire process and assembling this front end to the point where every single piece is on the kit, the hood closes and opens, the bumper cover is in place and looks good before you do a single weld fully. Everything should only be tacked. Don't screw yourself by getting too excited and wanting to just weld this thing right up. Everything is tacked because a tack can easily be cut and redone. So onto the driver's side here, you're going to see where I'm going to be throwing the tape measure up in. So this is where I'm doing that measurement, and I'm checking somewhere between 2 inches and 2¼ inches roughly to the center of the hole off of that tube is where we're going to be. So just putting it in place, tapping it around, checking it. You might end up at 2 1/8, you might end up at 2, you might end up at 2 1/4. Everyone's car can be a little bit different, depending on where you have your fender set based on the hood. I've got an aftermarket hood, so my gaps are set differently than what a factory setup is going to be. So that's why I have to say there's a range in those measurements, because every aftermarket hood is different, and the only cars that are going to be exact are going to be cars with untouched front ends that have never been in a wreck. Fenders never been adjusted. Hood's never been adjusted from the factory, which they are out there. Some of you guys have probably a perfect car. Other guys have had cars that have had work done at some point, and stuff might not be exact. Okay, so here I am drawing a cross measurement. I'm going off of that pinch weld on the upper part of the rails, and I did a cross measurement to the inside of the frame rails on the front, just making sure that that front end is nice and square on the front of the car. Here I'm going over the position of how that tube lands on that plate. Keep in mind, that's where I said I was too close to the inside of the car. I ended up having to swing that out. You can see I'm right on the edge there. Later on, I ended up with a very heavy 1/4 inch of plate showing there before my bumper cover landed on that the way I wanted it to be. But I didn't recognize that until I finally had the bumper cover on and the car was just about finished up, and I had to go back and break the tacks on the kit and twist the pipe just a little bit more, and then all of a sudden the bumper cover lined up, and I was able to drill the hole and put a fresh nutsert in, and it was ready to go. Now here I'm bringing the bumper cover over to test fit it, and this is where I should have caught it initially as far as that tube being tacked in the wrong place. But what I was looking for when I'm putting the cover on right now was I was actually just trying to adjust bumper sag, how it lines up to the headlights, and on the fenders, whether I needed to go up or down with the bumper cover. And I didn't pay attention to where those where that cover lands on the tube. I would have caught it right away and fixed it. Instead, I ended up having to do it towards the end. Just putting the bolts back in the bumper cover here on the fenders. As you can see, if you've done this halfway decent, I mean, there's literally nothing holding that bumper cover. It is just sitting there in place. So as long as you have everything set up on there nicely, you should be able to slide the thing right on. And then from that point, if you need to, what you would do is you'd go underneath the bumper cover where you can see that lower support through the grill, get yourself the jack underneath there, maybe a block of wood, whatever. And if you needed to go up or down with that to properly adjust the bumper cover, you would need to break the tacks on those headlight tubes, not up at the top of the car, but you're going to break it on the lower rail. So you're going to have to reach in there, hit it with the cutoff wheel, and break it. And then from that point, you can either jack the front end up or down, and it's going to pivot the lower rail assembly off of the end cap plates, and those headlight tubes will just slide along that rail, and it's going to be very minimal change, and you could change the front end a 1/4 inch easily and then reach back in there and tack weld it once you're happy. I got lucky. I got it on the first try. There was zero issue with how this was set up. Again, I just only needed to change the headlight tubes to match the bumper cover to bolt the cover down on the tube itself. Okay, here I'm getting ready to put the hood bump stops in that I've made. These pieces you bend at 90 degrees where the laser etch mark is on the plate in a vise, smack it with a hammer, and that last fender bolt right there you're going to pull out, and this piece slides right underneath the fender. The factory bolt goes back into place, and it lands right on that upper rail. You'll have to clean that area up there because you're going to end up welding it once you're done. You just position that into place. It'll fit real nice if you've made it a 90, and your factory hood rubber bump stop, if you will screw right back into that. That hole is lasered with the keyhole spot, just like the factory core support is. You take a screwdriver and just stick it in on the tabs and give it a little bit of a twist so that you create an entry point for that rubber snubber to screw down into, and you'll have no issues screwing that right in, and the rubber bump stop lands right on the frame of the hood, and that'll allow you to adjust that hood height left and right to the fenders, and also the gap on your front bumper cover as you need it to be. Here I'm just sliding the fender right back into the factory paint mark. Lining it up to that rail. Just a little bit of a snug, make sure it's where I want it to be. And I'm able to screw the rubber bump stop right back in. Dropping the hood down, just checking the alignment to the fenders. If I need to screw one of those bump stops up or down. Okay, now we're dropping the radiator back into the factory location here. And I'm going to start working on putting the upper upper radiator support bar in and the hood latch assembly on the car. Now, what's important here is that you have measured where your radiator lands, which is what I'm drawing the measurement right now. That measurement needs to be done prior to you cutting this front end off. What I'm doing is I'm putting the radiator right back to the same place, drawing off of that frontmost strut tower bolt to the center point of the pins on the radiator. This gives you the reference point, and then what I did, as you can see there, is I just took a bunch of masking tape and taped up onto the fenders and onto the crash bar, because you can easily stretch it one way or the other to get that radiator right back where it needs to be. Make sure you write that measurement down, what it is on your car, and you can just use tape just like that to hold it in place. There's the upper radiator support. It comes with 2 pieces of billet 4130 that are threaded for a 3/8/16 bolt. That is in the kit. You get the hardware and lock washers. That slides right in the end of the tube, and you're going to be able to adjust that in or out of the tube depending on the width of your front end. How you set those headlight tubes. Just tapping it in there. Now, chances are you're going to probably end up with somewhere, if this is done just right, around a 1/16 of an inch of that insert sticking out. And the reason I say that is once that is bolted together and the bolts are in the end of that, they're going to just fit in between the 2 pieces of bumper cover that come up and land on the headlight tubes. If you extend it out any further than that, then those bolts are not going to fit in between the cover, and you're going to fight putting the cover up on top of those tubes. It should fit just in between it. Okay, so now I'm taking the factory upper radiator brackets and setting them in place, because your upper radiator support is going to actually hook to these. This helps you locate exactly where the hood latch is going to be. That's why we've got the radiator taped in place, and then we set the brackets on. Try to set your tape up just like I did there, because everything helps hold each other in place to get you started. All right, now setting the radiator brackets up on the radiator, we're going to put that tube over top of the tape, but underneath the brackets. And you can see I've got the little tabs there. We're going to be landing them just on the inside of the headlight tubes. You don't really need to grind these to shape or anything. You're going to have a little bit of a gap because you got a square plate landing on a round tube, but you'll be able to fill it in. When that's set up right, the gap's going to be pretty minimal. We're setting that radiator tube just so that it meets with the center point of the factory holes in the front. So you kind of get that set in place. You're going to see I'm going to put some magnets in place to help hold it. So there's a picture of it. The magnets are in place holding it, and see how the tube is actually centered on that bolt hole, because you're going to be drilling that, putting a nutsert in, and a 1/4 inch 20 bolt, and that's exactly where that thing will land. If the radiator is put right back into place where it was, bracket set on top of it, that's where that tube should land, is just touching those brackets, and the side tabs there where the magnet is lands just on the inside of that tube. And you're going to give that thing a couple of tacks, and now the radiator is located where it's supposed to be, and the upper support is located where it's supposed to be, because the hood latch is going to mount directly to that tube on the front and go right where it's supposed to into the hood. Here I'm just checking measurements side to side. So what I did is I measured off of the lower frame rail up to that upper radiator support, just to make sure that it was level going across the front of the car. Take your time, draw lots of measurements, compare. You want to get everything as close as possible. The chances of you getting it absolutely perfect, pretty slim, but it's not going to matter as long as your body panels line up and the hood closes. If the thing is shifted an 1/8 inch one way or the other, or up or down, it's not the end of the world. No one's ever going to notice it, especially once the bumper cover is on. Using that square coming off of the piece of hood sticking down that the hood latch grabs, I'm putting a mark on the tube so that I know when I put the hood latch assembly on, the center of that hood latch, the throat of it, if you will, where the bar comes down inside of it, is going to land right where that mark is. So there, I'm thickening up that mark. That is the center point of the latch, the throat of the latch, where the hood is going to close down on it. So that's an important mark to have there. And again, if you have your hood latch a little too far to the right or the left, you can break the tacks and re-tack it. But there is also quite a bit of adjustability in the latch itself, and you're going to find even if you think you got it perfect, you're probably going to end up loosening up that latch and moving it side to side. Here we're just showing some of the tacks that I put on there, so that the tacks are on that nutsert, and I guess nutsert, if you will, that the bolt is going into the end of the tube, so that it doesn't rotate, and we can tighten it down, and a couple of tacks on that piece of flat bar to the headlight tube itself. 2 to 3 tacks is more than sufficient. Keep those tacks in an area where you can easily cut them if you need to readjust that bar. That mark there is just where I'm going to drill for the nutsert. And there's the hood latch pieces that I pre-tacked together before putting on the tube itself. So I took the round circle piece and the trapezoid looking piece and tacked them to the little pieces of the tube in the kit that are supplied, and then tacked them onto the tube after the fact. Okay, so here we're finally bolting the hood latch on. I do supply those 1/4 inch 20 bolts with washers. We're going to put that in place. And again, if the mounts to the hood latch are a little off, you've got quite a bit of adjustment in your factory hood latch, the way it's designed, that you can slide that thing around. But keep your tacks in a place that you can easily cut it, because if you need to, you can shift this thing left or right. And you can also rotate that tube. You're going to find that hood latch actually needs to be rotated at the top towards the front of the car. It's not straight up and down. If you look at the way it latches into your car, or even your factory core support, if I had to guess, it's maybe a 10 to 15 degree angle towards the front of the car. So in other words, the top of the latch versus the bottom is angling forward 10 to 15 degrees. That tube, the way it's set up, the nice thing is all you do is crack those 2 3/8 bolts loose, and you are able to rotate that latch forward or backwards to make it land on the hood appropriately. And then you also have the actual side to side and up and down movement of those 1/4 inch 20 bolts. Toughest thing here is actually getting the hood latch to latch initially onto the hood with everything loose. You might find you need help with a buddy to push down on the hood, and you push up into the latch to get it latched initially. But once you get it latched to the hood, you're able to start adjusting it from that point. So what I did is I got it latched finally, and I keep readjusting and popping the hood latch till that hood closes down nicely. So rotating the upper core support by loosening those 3/8 bolts, readjusting the 1/4 inch bolts, and making sure that hood is pulled down nice and snug on top of those rubber bump stops, the way it would be from factory, so that the hood doesn't rattle up or down. So here I'm pretty happy with how I got it. The hood latch is closed. There's no up and down play to the hood. When I hit it, it releases how it should and springs right up and comes up. Okay, now that our hood opens and closes perfectly and the hood latch is aligned, now it's time to drill the holes for the nutserts that hold the factory radiator brackets on the top of the radiator. Don't do these holes or put these nutserts in before the hood latch and hood is adjusted 100%. So that hood should open and close perfectly. Hood latch disengages the way it needs to and engages the way it needs to. Then we mark and drill these holes. Reason being, that tube, you might rotate that a little bit just to get that hood latch to work a little better, and then all of a sudden it's going to throw off how those brackets bolt onto the radiator. So do those holes last. Our hood goes up and down good, and we drill the holes for the nutserts, put the nutserts in, and rivet them in place, and then we can put our brackets back on. Okay, you can see here we've got that front end lined up pretty nice. Everything's put in place. The upper radiator brackets are in place. Hood latch is in place. Everything's adjusted appropriately, and we go for our headlight tab bag. So these tabs right here, marked in the package, come with bolts, washers, and some nylon lock nuts. And these are going to be where you were measuring that 2 inch to 2 1/4 inch from the center of the hole to the tube. That's where those are going to go. You are going to have to trim these down. I purposely made them long. So as you can see here, they don't fit. They're long for a reason. You're going to cut basically kind of like a half moon shape in that bracket to get those things to land on the tube. Chances are they will land on the front of the headlight like that and not behind. Initially, I thought it was going to go behind it, but they don't. They ended up in front. Here I'm just grinding that half moon shape, if you will, into that tab. Okay, so now I have my piece ground to shape and we're tacking it in place. You can see there I did a half moon shape on that piece of flat bar so that it would sit on that tube halfway decent. You don't have to make it absolutely perfect. With a welder you can fill the hole. But it lines up nice to the headlight, able to put the bolt in. Again, nothing is fully welded at this point. Everything is tack welds until you know that that car is 100% bolted together. Everything lines up, and then when it's all done, then you can pull it back apart and actually start fully welding all the pieces. But do not fully weld anything until this thing is fully bolted together and you're happy with the way everything lines up. Over on the passenger side, you can see I'm kind of drawing the imaginary shape that I think it would be. You can see how it's lining up on the tube. Pretty darn close to where it needs to be. Clamp it in place with a pair of vice grips, pliers, whatever, and throwing a couple tacks on. All right, so here's the front end basically all assembled. All that's left from this point in the kit is going to be the 4 lower tabs that go on that lower support that go to your bumper cover. I'm not going to put those on in the video here because my setup is going to be different than everyone else's. I didn't want to have to break that all apart. But depending on where you place that lower radiator support, if you will, which isn't supporting the radiator, but we'll call it a bumper cover support, is going to depend on where you locate those tabs. That was that 6 3/4 measurement that could change. You could push that assembly further forward or back. Again, you got a welder, you adjust this stuff where you want it to be. That's why I can't give exact measurements for everyone because everyone's going to set their car up a little bit differently. Some guys have turbo cars, some guys have blower cars, and they're going to play with the adjustments on the front end and set those things where they want them to be. Here we're putting the tow hook assembly together, so you can see the reinforcing plate that goes behind the bumper cover support. That just gets tacked into place right where you see me setting it with the magnets. Now, if you push this lower support, if you will, bumper cover support, too far forward or too far back, it will mess with the tow hook as far as if you're going to be able to screw it in or not. So just keep in mind if you get really custom with this kit and you put that thing in a different place other than somewhere around that 6 3/4, 7-inch mark away from the lower frame rail, you may or may not be able to get your tow hook threaded in because you've changed it. I built the kit based off of the factory type specs, if you will, of where it should be and where it lands. I did it based off of how it normally screws into the crash beam, and this should position it very close to where it would be from factory. But if you modify the kit, then there's a chance that you might not get that tow hook support in exactly where you need it to be. If that ends up being the case and you need some extra pipe or a piece of plate or something like that to make the kit work for you, because you've modified it, just let me know. Shoot me a drawing, some measurements, and I can try and put it together for you. So now we've got our threaded insert piece and the little dog bone, if you will, that is also reinforcing it to the rail. Little magnet in there just to keep everything nice and square, held in place. And now you can see that basically keeps that threaded insert from being able to bend up or down and pull away from that frame rail because we're supporting everything on angles and 90s. And it just, think of the way a bridge is built. A bridge has got a bunch of webbing in it. That's essentially what we're doing here is we're just reinforcing everything. Make everything look halfway decent. The cope should line up halfway good. If it's not 100% perfect, keep in mind that, you can fill a pretty good size hole. And those gaps there, even on what I have, they're perfectly acceptable. They're not even really over a 1/16 of an inch. They're not any thicker than the welding wire itself is right there. Again, just tack everything. 1 or 2 tacks on everything. Nothing is heavy enough that anything is going to break. Tack the stuff in place. Confirm 100% that you're happy exactly where it is before you start welding anything.
Another thing to keep in mind, in the video we went over the distance between the center of the headlight bolt and the bar here. This measurement can change a little bit. Rule of thumb is going to be somewhere between 2 inches and 2¼ inches from the center of the bolt hole to lining up to this tube. That distance is going to change based on what it takes to get the upper portion of the tube to line up with the hole in the bumper cover where you're going to nutsert it down. This can be rotated a little bit in or out. You're not going to finalize this measurement until you've put your bumper cover up on the car and you take the bumper cover and push it down and physically make sure that that hole lands perfectly on the center of the tube, so that when you drill this and nutsert it, you're able to take a 1/4 inch 20 bolt, put it right down in place, holds the bumper cover where you want it to be. So again, this moves a little bit. That's also why we don't fully weld our inserts in the radiator support tube until we're done. Keep in mind, you don't weld anything actually until you're fully done and it's all put together and lines up, because if you weld anything fully, it's a pain in the butt to cut it back apart. You might as well just put a couple of tacks anywhere that you need, and then you can always just break a tack and put it back into place. If this tube ends up rotated out a little bit to line up with the bumper cover, the good thing is the insert can now come out of this tube a little bit, and maybe instead of a 1/16 of an inch of insert sticking out, you have an 1/8 inch, or you have 3/16 of an inch. These inserts are a 1/2 inch thick for that reason, so that you can slide them back and forth within this tube to locate the tab wherever you need it to be. So essentially, the length of that upper core support is changeable by sliding that insert in and out of the end of the tube. You're going to find through this process, there's a good chance that you're going to tack something and you're not going to like it, and 20 minutes later you're going to break that tack and you're going to re-tack it again in a different position. That's fine. The biggest thing is making sure that you put this initial lower rail and crash bar in centered on the car, which is why we marked out our end plates, and that this is built in some type of a jig so that when you tack these tubes, they are straight off the front of the car and they're not doing this. Because if they have even a 1/4 inch tip to one side, it's going to throw off your headlight tubes and you're going to struggle. All of a sudden this one tab is going to be a 1/2 inch longer than the other for some reason, and that's because something is not square on the front of the car. So you always want to pull a cross measurement, which we went over in the video, which is where you'll see me put the tape on the corner of the rail and I run it over and I take a look at the corner this way, and then I do a cross measurement that way, just to make sure that everything's in place. And again, slight tacks and everything. If you find that for some reason you've gotten to this point and you're still not happy with how the bumper cover is sitting, maybe it needs to go up a little bit in the front, maybe it needs to go down in order to get it to match with the hood. The nice thing is, all you got to do, keep the bumper cover on the car, break these tacks right here to the headlight tube, and if you put a floor jack, slide the floor jack right underneath the bumper cover is going to be on the underside of this bar. You can just physically jack up on that a little bit, and you can either raise it up or go down. And once you get into the position that you want, you need to climb inside the car and throw another tack back on the tube, because this vertical tube here is what's keeping this front end supported. So it's just a matter of breaking that tack. That's why on the inside of the plates you saw earlier in the video, all I did is one nice heavy tack in the center using a 1/16 inch welding rod, spacing it out so that this thing has room to pinch on those end plates, and we can tweak that assembly up or down to adjust where your bumper cover sits. In the end, this thing should be fitting pretty nice and snug against that cover so that over time it doesn't droop or fall down. If we put some foam padding in here, then what would happen is that foam padding is going to settle after a little while, and guess what? There's nothing you can do to fix it because this is all welded solid. So that's why we don't run a pool noodle or anything in here. I don't suggest that. Let that bumper cover sit directly on the metal, because it's never going to settle. It's only going to sit where it sits, and that's it. The other thing here, your tow hook, earlier in the video you saw that I kind of turned my hand like this. What that meant is this assembly, even from the factory on the factory crash bar, actually has a kick out like this to meet up with the bumper cover. We end up with the same situation here. I didn't use my factory tow hook in here to place this. In the video I just kind of put it in place. I knew about how many degrees of tip I needed, used some magnets. Obviously you want to thread your tow hook through the bumper cover with it on and put this piece in place, and this is where a friend helps you out. They can be holding that tow hook with this insert up against, and you can climb in there and you can throw a tack weld on it, or if you don't want to do that, run a magic marker around it to mark the position of it. You know, if you've done any fabrication, you'll figure it out. You know, these are just little steps along the way that I can't tell you 100% of how to do this, but there's not that many parts here. You should be able to figure it out. We just put this thing together in about 5 hours with the camera guy watching, and I did it 100% by myself without him helping. Just magnets, a couple of clamps, floor jack, basic tools, nothing crazy or fancy. Big thing is making sure your car is as level as possible on the shop floor, so that when you're standing back and eyeballing something, it's not throwing you off because the car's tilted 3/4 of an inch the other way. So do your best to just get the car kind of leveled out and slightly elevated. You don't want this thing down on the floor, because if it's down on the floor, you're going to struggle. Realistically, the higher you can get this off the ground, if you're using 4 jack stands, you get it 1.5 feet off the ground, the better. I have a little bit of an advantage because we use a scissor jack underneath it, or a scissor lift anyway, so I can throw this car up in the air and put it down. If you got one of those, great. If not, it's not necessary. Just I've done enough of these tube fronts and roll cages that over the years I found that it's just awesome to have my stuff on a scissor lift, and I can work way faster. But when you're doing it to make money, it's a different story. If you're doing this at home, you can do it in a weekend with just basic things. You don't have to get fancy with anything, with lifts or anything. Just jack stands, floor jack, blocks of wood. Other than that, pretty straightforward. If for any reason you find something on this front end you would like to change, just reach out to me. You might say, hey, I want to do this differently or that differently. We could talk about possibly modifying the kit if it's not going to quite work. Or if you need those extra parts where, you know, you're hanging a turbo off, or you're putting a chiller somewhere, or putting the intercooler somewhere, and you need some extra tube bent with a tab to hold it, you know, extra nut certs, anything of that nature, I'll certainly work with you any way I can, or at least lead you in the direction you need to go to get those materials. So with that said, again, just reach out if you have any issues, and you should be able to get this thing together in a weekend and start enjoying the weight benefits and also the added room, because as you can see, this is it. This is, other than a couple of tabs for the bumper cover, you have all this added room everywhere to go. We're talking upwards of 10 plus inches between the condenser and the crash bar now, that you can fit a monster 5-6 inch thick, 7 inch thick even charge cooler up here. If you're running a turbo, you can stack up tranny coolers. Anything you need in this area can be mounted directly to any of this stuff. It's just super easy to come off of it with a piece of steel, whether it's a piece of flat bar, a piece of tubing, angle iron, whatever you need. You're going to save 30 pounds off the front of the car, 29 and some change, depending on how many extra tabs you add. But keep in mind, it doesn't sound like a big number, but you're taking it off the nose. Mathematically, in the horsepower calculator, it's not going to change how fast the car necessarily goes when you're talking your 60 foot or you know, 1/8 mile, 1/4 mile. But what it does change is your weight bias, and 30 pounds lost off the very nose of the car is probably at launch better than 100 pounds out of the chassis in the center where you sit, because it's all about the rear axle and lifting the weight all the way in the front of the car to get the car to squat, or in the center of the car. So saving 100 pounds in the cabin is not going to be as effective as the 30 pounds off of the nose of the car. So it's about losing that weight and gaining all this room for you to package this thing however you want. Keep in mind, I did talk about positioning this radiator lower and further forward. You still have plenty of room. If you wanted to drop this thing down, those lower mounts that I provide would mount to this tube right here, and you could essentially take this whole assembly, which right now this is sitting 100% in the factory position. This is where it was, okay? It's sitting on the K-member, and it's positioned exactly in the top based on drawing measurements off of the strut tower. I know exactly where this radiator was supposed to be. You will too, because you will have taken those measurements before you cut this off. You could take this thing and drop it down 2 more inches down to this bar right here, and then you just, instead of using this hole on your factory upper radiator holes, you would actually use this hole here, and you could come down onto this and lower that radiator down. Now, for your blower guys, that would be an advantage for one big reason, and that is typically the throttle body is right here, and then when you get into a situation like my car with a 2650 and the air it flows, you want a solid big 5-inch intake. Bigger if you can. Problem is, typically the radiator is in the way, and you just can't get a good elbow here. By lowering this radiator, it gets it away from that elbow, and it creates more room for you to have a larger intake and flow more air. You'd be surprised, again, what kind of power you can pick up by having a much larger intake here. Do you lose drivability? Absolutely. But you're building a race car, right? It's all about airflow, horsepower. The other advantage of dropping the radiator down, again, what I was talking about with you turbo guys, if we can take this radiator and we can lower this down 2+ inches and tip it, you could take this and put the radiator in front of this tube. There's enough room in here with the cover on that you can put the mounts, the lower radiator mounts, facing forward with a tip up and rake that radiator back like this. By doing that, you put it down, rake it back. You wouldn't use this support anymore. You would be going to the other version, which is V'd, like this Crashbar is. It opens this whole area up right here. So you'd run hood pins, you'd ditch the hood latch, and you could run a huge shear fab charge cooler right here with a center out tank and go boom, right into your throttle body. If you don't want to go through all that, you really want your factory hood latch, that's fine. You're just going to need a side exit tank with one of those charge coolers. And there is enough room right here. I'm going to grab a pipe, hang tight. This is a 4-inch charge pipe. Not many guys run this big. Usually guys are running 3-inch, but a 4-inch charge pipe can fit in here and have room. So you can run a massive charge pipe right around your radiator now, right off the top of the intercooler, and curve it right into your throttle body. That's one of the benefits to this kit, is the room that it gives you and the ability to do just about anything you want. You could even relocate your fuse box like some guys do to up in that corner, and you could run it this way if you wanted to. Whatever direction you want to go, you can do it. This room gives you the kit. This kit gives you the room to do all that. I haven't seen any other way that you can package this big of a charge pipe without hacking your car up anyways. And then you don't have the strong mounting points. You've got thin sheet metal that, you know, you can't hang a turbo off of it. You have to reinforce it. You put yourself a big 92mm turbo or something hanging up off the front, you got to brace it like crazy off of the frame rail because you'll just rip that thin metal apart. This tubing is thick enough and strong enough that you can come right off of this with a turbo mount, hang whatever you want off the front end, and it's not going to break or bend. Again, if you guys have any questions, concerns, reach out. I have no problem doing a actual video call with you. We can troubleshoot. You can throw me some drawings of parts that you need. Either way, I'm here to help you out and help you build your race car. So thanks again, guys. Talk to you soon.